Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola, the managing editor for Shadowproof.com. I've got another update. I'll try to be a little bit quicker in this update, but I wanted to close and complete the coverage that I've been doing of the March 17 primaries in the run-up. There was some activism involved, organizing people who were medical professionals that objected to going forward because of the safety risks, the potential public health risks to voters who would go out when we are all expected to stay at home and quarantine during this global pandemic, during the coronavirus. And so I wanted to talk to you about what happens now after these coronavirus primaries, as I'm calling them, what took place on March 17th. There were clear indications that they should not have gone forward. We have examples of voter disenfranchisement as well as voter suppression that took place during the March 17 primaries in Illinois, in Florida, and to a lesser degree in Arizona. But that's because a vast majority of the voting was enabled through mail-in ballot system. There was also at least in Maricopa County, they had centers where you could basically go wherever and drop off your ballot. That's what I understand. So it made things a little bit easier. But we're in the middle of this epidemic that is ramping up here. And then at the same time, we're somehow expected to engage in this Democratic presidential primary, or we're not. In fact, most of the pundits want it all to be over. It was a race all the way up until March 10th, and then they declared it over because of Bernie Sanders' loss in Michigan. And then on March 11th, we had the World Health Organization declare the coronavirus a global pandemic. And then with that, you saw politics essentially freeze in time. And what's important to stay here right now is that the Democratic National Committee did not develop the primary with a pandemic in mind. That primary calendar, I need to say this over and over again, was not developed with a pandemic in mind. It should be flexible. And in the same way, and maybe even to a larger degree than what we've seen happen with sports, with March Madness being canceled, with the NBA suspending their season, with the Masters tournament being moved and postponed, I think that to an even greater extent, you need flexibility from the DNC in order to accommodate people so that they can still participate in the primary that was unfolding. And the same way that people were participating before this all happened. So this is an emergency, and it's far more intense than the 9/11 attacks in the aftermath. It's far more intense for communities thus far than I expect it to be more intense than the aftermath of hurricanes. After months, you start to rebuild, and the ramifications are more widespread, and in those instances you had particular communities that were the most impacted. So frankly, I have to say, for anyone to engage in punditry or analysis of the presidential race last night in the same way that they would have back in February is frankly obnoxious. It's especially deranged to engage in these pressure campaigns to try to force Bernie Sanders to drop out of the race, to gloat about the way in which Joe Biden seemingly just crushed his opponent, and act like this was a normal political process that unfolded. It's absolutely not. This pandemic unfolding in the background means that everything happening has this extra tinge to it of illegitimacy, because this shouldn't be happening while people are trying to make life or death decisions. I think that even worse, it's wrong for people to blame Bernie Sanders for the problems that states are having dealing with the primaries, because even if he did drop out, these states would still have races. They would still have elections they needed to execute because there are people down ballot. We saw in the state of Illinois that a notorious conservative Democrat, Dan Lipinski, known for his pro-life views, known for being anti-gay, lost. This was something that progressives had been targeting him for a long time. Marie Newman won in that congressional race. And so we still need people to turn out and vote in these primaries. And maybe they want to protect their incumbents. I think that's certainly an ulterior motive. It would be a byproduct of telling people that Bernie Sanders is not going to be in the race anymore. I mean, if he withdrew, then he wouldn't be there on there'd be less of a motive for people to go out and vote for him. And then maybe that would filter down to down ballot races. And that's not a good thing. So what should states do now? Well, okay, so we had March 17th. And if I could just give you a bit of a summary of what happened here. Essentially, you have the basic fact that we were able to see from Florida and Illinois that there were people who were standing in long lines, that in fact it was evident that people were being packed into rooms that were poorly ventilated, it's particularly in the city of Chicago. And this was happening all during the middle of an acceleration phase of the coronavirus pandemic. Now, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention recognizes that this is the period where the virus infects people and that social distancing is crucial to slow the outbreak. Yet, in my view, there was an incredibly reckless move on the part of the Democrats to defy the concerns of medical professionals, on the part of state officials in Arizona, Florida, and Illinois, who decided to listen to the politicians and proceed with these previously scheduled primaries. Multiple states, postponed their primaries before in-person voting took place on March 17th, which was yesterday. But rather than respect this fact, we know now that the Democratic National Committee has been threatening states with the loss of delegates if they do not get these primaries in before June 9th. So they have not engaged in any constructive action to try to develop ways to help states. And they're basically putting pressure on states in a moment when they're also strained as far as resources go to respond to the pandemic. I think it's untenable to expect states to be able to also manage these primaries at the same time that they're trying to do a pandemic. And so you need officials who will work with these states to move dates and allow for people to still be able to participate. And essentially, I think you need to go to a system where all in-person voting is canceled and you expand the absentee ballot system. And that's the emergency modification that you would have so that people can still have their voices heard. But thus far, what you've seen are progressive groups actually shirking their duty. You've had groups who are chapters of the ACLU. You've had Common Cause. You have Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. You've had these different groups who actually were upset that these states were moving the dates because they felt they were ill prepared to protect the health of voters and also accommodate everyone. I mean, we had polling places shut down. Entire polling places did not open. Somewhere around 10% of polling places in the city of Chicago did not open on election day after 4 hours of the election day. And so people were told to go to another site, and there was a line that was about 3 hours long where people were waiting 2 and 3 hours. You had in the second biggest Latino district in Illinois, you had people there waiting for over an hour. You had people in senior citizens locations with African Americans, older African Americans packed in waiting for an hour or so to vote. This is just unconscionable. And the city knew it. They warned Illinois. J.B. Pritzker reportedly said, hey, deal with it. move on. And in fact, the day before the primary, J.B. Pritzker endorsed Joe Biden. So maybe that has something to do with the ultimate decision. But let's keep going forward here, and let's say, what do the states need to do in order to move forward? I think that you need to see groups be very clear and principled in their opposition to the DNC, which has been threatening these states. You need officials who are politicians to stop making these statements about safety for voters. They do not know the science. They are not people that can speak to what will be the threat of this pandemic to individuals. We had officials talking about how they could bring on high school students or young people to work in place of elderly polling place workers. We know now that there have been young people who have been taking up spaces in intensive care units in Italy, and that was also the case in China. We're going to put a tremendous strain on the system if we're acting like young people are not as likely to get sick as older people. I mean, I think it just means that they can handle the virus. It doesn't mean that they should be so lackadaisical about all this as if they can't be sick and infect other people. And young people are not invincible, and if older people are going to if they're going to be really worked up over all the teenagers and college kids who are down in Florida having the spring break because they don't want to cancel their plans, then they also have to be consistent and say, we can't have students working in the spot of elderly polling place workers. That's not the solution to continuing these primaries in a pandemic. So you also have people like Simone Sanders, who was the Biden advisor, who's a Biden advisor, who was on CNN, said something like, the CDC said that these are safe, and so folks can proceed to vote, which was not true. The CDC made no statement whatsoever about the safety of the primaries on March 17th. That was misinformation. I think it's fair to say that was Trump-like misinformation. So secondly, with the primaries out of the way, we now have, because Biden has this commanding lead, we have seen that Tom Perez of the DNC and other Democrats are backing alternatives to in-person voting. This is what I was advocating for in putting together the petition. This is what others were saying needed to be done. It's what medical professionals were saying needed to be done in this moment, that you would expand the ability of people to vote simply by sending everyone registered, or sending depending on the system that you have in a state, maybe you just send every person a ballot, give them the opportunity to register to vote if they would like, and they get these ballots, and then they can participate in the election. They mail it back. You extend the deadlines because of what's going on here and how crazy everything is, and then you allow people to participate without being disenfranchised. You allow a way around the fact that people are quarantined and they might not be able to show up to polling places. We had examples in Florida of people who are quarantining, who tried to get affidavits and have their votes submitted, but organizations like the Dream Defenders in Florida were trying to stand up for them, and they were unable to do so, unable to get their votes counted, even though they were quarantining in a place that was away from their home, so they could not participate in the Florida primary. I think what we should recognize right now is that the politics around this primary froze in place. You've heard this from the pundit class, that they froze right before this pandemic truly escalated. And what it did is it benefited Joe Biden. And so essentially, if you walk through the timeline, you have a Super Tuesday. Let's go back a couple more days. You have South Carolina. You have a kingmaker in Representative Jim Clyburn, who says to everyone they need to go out and vote for Joe Biden. He's an African-American representative who's well respected in the Democratic Party. He delivers those Democratic voters to Joe Biden. And Biden wins very handily in South Carolina. So he's now has this momentum. And then what happens is on Monday, before Super Tuesday, you see, and as well as on Sunday, from Sunday to Monday, you see Obama making calls behind the scenes. You have Amy Klobuchar dropping out, Pete Buttigieg dropping out. You have a coalescence around Joe Biden. And then you have, it's clear that Mike Bloomberg is weaker. Days later, he's going to drop out. But importantly, on Super Tuesday, because of this unity that comes around Joe Biden, he wins the vast majority of the primaries on Super Tuesday. And Bernie Sanders did not crush in the same way that he crushed the primary in Nevada. He did very, very well in Nevada. So he doesn't have that same outcome. And the establishment is able to avoid disaster as was coming down the pike for them if they did not unite around Joe Biden. And then as people thought this is an inevitable nominee, you're able to draw people over to Biden's campaign. And at that point, you have a lot working for you if you're in the Biden campaign, because the media is giving you this free sort of backing for what you're doing. They see the strategy playing out. They see an answer to Bernie Sanders. You no longer have this panic. Remember, we had Chris Matthews on air talking about how there were going to be shootings in Central Park. He even had to retire as a result because the MSNBC was losing any sort of confidence in his ability to be an anchor on air during the broadcasts and coverage of the elections. And so now what happened is, because of this moment, you have things crystallizing that makes it almost impossible for Bernie Sanders to make up the margin. What you see in polls is it's about 60 to 40, where you go state to state and you find that 60% of people are for Biden and you have 40%, 35% for Bernie Sanders. And it's because the media has been able to indoctrinate and convince people that Biden is the more electable candidate. There's really no evidence to back that up. It's just the way that their attitudes are, and people don't even really know what makes Joe Biden reckless or not reckless, a risky choice and not a risky choice. So that is one of the things that is working in Biden's favor, is with this pandemic as a backdrop. You can't truly have any kind of meaningful discussion about electability, because any sort of conversation about the habitual lying is seen as divisive among people at a time when we need to come together. I think there's a huge institutional pressure on Bernie Sanders to be nice and play nice. And he's definitely feeling that, because making those distinctions with Joe Biden in this time of crisis just seems to destroy people who are trying to come together and support each other. And it's unfortunate, because I think these things need to be said. We need to be honest about the kind of candidate that Joe Biden is and will be if he's going to be the Democratic nominee. I'm certainly, as a journalist, I'm not holding back. I'm going to write about Joe Biden in the way that I would, regardless of whether he's supposed to beat Donald Trump or not, regardless of whether or not we're all supposed to mobilize and get Biden elected over Donald Trump in November. I still have to tell citizens about the truth around his campaign. There's also the fact that most people are finding trust Joe Biden to be able to handle a major crisis like this pandemic, more so than Bernie Sanders. You're seeing 6 in 10 in Illinois, 6 in 10 in Arizona, 7 in 10 people in Florida. This is similar to polling that was in Michigan, Missouri, Washington, and those were in the primaries back on March 10th, where people, clear majorities, saying they feel, they don't really know why. These are learned opinions from watching too much MSNBC or CNN. They really should turn off that cable news, but they strongly believe that something about Joe Biden, just because he was in President Barack Obama's administration, he's going to be more capable to deal with a crisis like the one we're seeing happen now. Even though, there's actually a limit to what we've seen from Joe Biden. He doesn't go on live streams like Bernie Sanders. He doesn't speak a lot to the media. He sent a surrogate out after the debate on March 15th. I think there's a real limitation when it comes to his health and ability to be nimble around these issues. Biden's proposals around coronavirus, which have been put forward, are very reactive. They're geared towards winning in November. They're political. They're designed to make Trump look bad. And I think tactically that's probably the way to do it if you're just thinking electorally. But when you examine Bernie Sanders' proposals, they are far and away better for the fact that they're proactive, because they go to the core of overhauling systems that need to be addressed. The healthcare systems goes to addressing the lack of manufacturing jobs that we have. And I think that people need to look more closely at what Bernie Sanders is proposing. I want to get into it just a little bit here before I wrap up this broadcast. So that brings us to, what should Bernie Sanders do? And I know technically I probably shouldn't be in the business of offering campaign advice, and that's not really for journalists to do. But I think because pundits are out there being so mean and nasty and primarily towards Bernie Sanders supporters, but I guess also even more toxic towards Bernie Sanders and his campaign as well. I mean, we actually saw fake news spread about how Bernie Sanders' campaign was suspended, and then it turned out that they were just misreporting. He had only stopped paying for Facebook ads. He was still going to keep up with his campaign. And then they were like, well, Bernie Sanders is not suspending his campaign. So now it made him look like a bad guy, like he's continuing to campaign during a pandemic and he's insensitive to people. So they're being assholes. And I think that sort of makes me feel like if they're going to do that, then I'm going to step up and compensate just a little bit, because people need to hear an alternative viewpoint. There needs to be something out there. And I don't have I'm a very tiny audience. I'm not going to be able to make up for what CNN and MSNBC and these other journalists like Max Boot, David Fromm, Jen Rubin, all these people, like, it's not any way that I can make up for what they're doing, but I'm compelled to say something because they're being such assholes. And so, and I must put it that bluntly, because I think there's no other word that is appropriate for exactly how they're behaving. So how should his campaign go forward? What kind of moral responsibility does he have right now in this moment to his supporters, and then also to this country? And also, I mean, he's a senator, and what should he be doing as a senator? I think that what I personally would appreciate seeing and would like to tell people that I have found very valuable and calming in this time of crisis are these live streamed speeches that he's been doing. I think his voice getting on every day to provide some kind of a address to people is very much needed in this moment. And I know that more people are watching those addresses because he's still a presidential candidate. He's using that platform. And so that gives people a chance to hear his ideas. It gives people a chance to see what are these proposals that the Senate Democrats and the wider Congress should be moving forward on, instead of just these little piecemeal, reactive, temporary Band-Aid measures that are being considered that do help people, but they only last for a few days, maybe a month, and then you're back to having to deal with the fact that we're being plunged into a recession by this pandemic. And so, I think that we need to continue to hear him. He's spoken about the most vulnerable. He's talked about prisoners in jails and the prison system. He's spoken about the homeless people who have been immediately laid off. He's very strongly articulated the issues within the gig economy right now, where people are not able to work because you don't have events happening. And so we need to see more of this conversation, and that's why his voice is necessary. But that said, I think that he should take the moment. I'm one of those people who has come around to this idea in the last few days, as I think about how impossible it is to have this primary while you're in the middle of this pandemic. I mean, let's be honest. all of us think that this would be much different right now if there wasn't a pandemic. You would be able to canvass, you would be able to hold rallies, you would be able to engage people in this process. It's so unfortunate that we were all dealt this hand as we were trying to have this Democratic primary and put together the try to make sure we had the best nominee to face Donald Trump, and we're not really able to vet candidates because we need to focus our attention on the fact that this country, which is being proven to be a rather shithole country, does not have the capacity to deal with people who are getting sick. We're going to have maxed out intensive care units, and it's awful what we're seeing happen. We don't have the supplies necessary to protect healthcare workers, and so those are the issues that we really need to be paying attention. And we don't really have time to go back and forth on the records of these candidates and try to prove who's better than each other. And so that said, I think that the best thing that Bernie Sanders could do is if he were to have some kind of a speech where he told people he was suspending his campaign. This does not mean dropping out. It would be up to all of us to make that distinction along with him, that he is not dropping out, he is not withdrawing. People would still be able to vote for him in all of these primaries that are coming up by mail. I mean, I think we want emergency absentee ballots to be sent out. That's the way that you would vote. But you'd still be able to see him accumulate those delegates. We want him to keep accumulating those delegates because that's how you're going to be able to insert issues into the platform. That's how you're going to be able to continue to engage in this kind of activism that this movement has been able to bring to the table and actually affect the conversation. I mean, we have moved everything left. People who believe in these policy ideas have had such a tremendous impact. Any centrist or moderate can barely say anything about what they would like to do without having to answer for why that is a miserable option compared to something radical like expanding Medicare to cover all Americans. I mean, think of how outrageous it was that Joe Biden said that he would veto Medicare for all during a pandemic. Well, that's why we still need Bernie Sanders and the movement around Bernie Sanders to talk to people and the entire nation, because that struggle has to still be happening out in the open. And in this crisis, when people are fearful and anxious and they're it's most possible that we could mold their minds. We don't want them to be molded by demagogues and authoritarians. We want them to be molded by inspirational figures who are going to appeal to the goodness of people's hearts. And that is what Bernie Sanders and his campaign is trying to do. That's not what Joe Biden's trying to do. I mean, he's kind of using that rhetoric, but by and large, what this guy wants to do is prove that he himself is a leader. This is about him. The way he speaks is about what we can do for him during this coronavirus pandemic. I do not believe for a moment that this man is capable, Joe Biden, of having this kind of rhetoric where we could bring people together and actually make changes. He has no interest in doing that. And also look at his condition. He doesn't have the energy and the ability to truly inspire people and speak to people's needs. And so all we can really hope for if Joe Biden is the nominee is that people just are fed up with Donald Trump and they're going to accept going back to the status quo, but that may not, and I would believe is not going to be good enough, which is where, even though we've been spit upon, people within the Bernie Sanders movement have been just treated so nastily. We have to grin and bear it and accept that abuse, because not within the Democratic Party, but within all of the different groups and organizations that are involved in mutual aid and helping each other out, within all of the different groups that are doing things that are crucial at this moment. We have to support those efforts and provide this counterbalance to the atrocious politics that we see within both the Democratic and the Republican parties. We've seen that the coronavirus response bill is probably going to be signed. It has some things that are good measures. but still, despite the unemployment assistance, the measures that are going to be available for low-income mothers in order to get help getting food. There's a small kind of paid family and sick leave in there, but we still had Nancy Pelosi sell out 6 million Americans who work for companies with 500 employees or more. And without them being able to get this sick leave, they fall through the cracks. And that is just not allowed. And that's why someone like Bernie Sanders can come in and push Senate Democrats. And so suspending the campaign means 2 to 3 weeks of focusing. We really don't have primaries going forward until the final weeks of April. There's going to be a primary in Wisconsin, but there's time for that state to get the ballot out to people. He can do an address. He can speak to voters there. So long as they're not going outside of their homes, there really aren't any risks. I think he still should speak to those Wisconsin voters. Hopefully those Wisconsin voters are receptive to his message. But we've seen postponements of these primaries, and that's why the bullying from the DNC has taken place. And so, that leads me to, I think, in speaking to people about what are the next steps for the campaign, he really should be making this argument to voters that that puts the Democratic Party establishment on the defensive for not pausing this primary. I think they need to be made to defend pushing onward with this. Like I said earlier, we had all of these institutions hit the pause button or seize it entirely. And I think the DNC should have used whatever sort of committee they had to hold a meeting and say, we're going to reform this calendar. We are going to move this all. So we still want people who are out there in these states to be able to participate. The fact that they didn't feeds into the argument of how every 4 years this process is just about getting their preferred candidate to the finish line, and anyone else who is in there is at a disadvantage. We saw that with Hillary Clinton. There were clear examples of the Democratic Party establishment rigging this process in order to favor their preferred candidate, Hillary Clinton. And now Joe Biden wasn't always the preferred candidate. I don't think they knew who they really wanted until February. But now, hey, we're going to make it happen. Even in a global pandemic, we're going to be sociopathic in our tendencies, and we're going to get Joe Biden those delegates so that Bernie Sanders can't take advantage of this crisis and overtake him. We want to keep the politics, the way things are, how everyone views what's happening in the world crystallized. We don't want that to shift. We don't want any polls to be moving. We got to keep Joe Biden from fading. And we got to get him these delegates now, even though there are life and death situations playing out state to state to state, including in New York, where they basically had 1,000 more cases of the coronavirus than in one day. I mean, that's what we're talking about. And at the same time, you've got Tom Perez and the DNC trying to shepherd their candidate to the finish line. So I think he needs to make these statements about how there can't be an appearance of a fairness. There can't be this voter suppression and disenfranchisement. He needs to speak up for the people who are coming out to vote. Already, we had people in his campaign that were at polling places who did care about voters, who were telling everyone that, this is wrong. Voters' lives are being put at risk. We don't know. Next week, a week later, 2 weeks from now, so to speak, we might find that there was a lot of mixing that happened on primary day, and people got sick. Elderly might get sick. The very base of Biden's support, those people might get sick. They have severe illness. Who knows how many people who voted for Joe Biden on primary day, what I call the coronaviruses, are not even going to be around to vote for Donald Trump because tragically they gave themselves a death sentence by going out to vote. That's something that people need to contemplate and consider. Thus far, nobody in the establishment has been willing to address this reality. And what are they going to do if they find out that they were telling people to go out to vote and those people ended up becoming severely ill or worse. So I think you need to make I do not care about the Democratic Party. I'm not trying to save it. I'm not part of the Democratic Party. Let me just be clear here. I say this as somebody who's observing politics. I say this as a thing of like, how can you be fair to people? How can you be good and honor your supporters? And I think what you want to say you want to challenge the Democratic Party establishment and say that there is no legitimacy to this when you have what has been unfolding. And so you Democratic Party leaders have to come up with a way to make people believe that this was fair. And right now, what you're doing is so brazenly in your face and not fair that you're just the wounds, remember the wounds from 2016? You're reopening them again and again and again. They're not healing. You're going to try to force unity upon people at the convention if it is held in July, if it is still held in Milwaukee. And there you're going to tell people they all need to align behind Joe Biden, even though a lot of his people around him and his campaign staff are condescending and super smug every single day, and there's nothing that anyone wants to do for them. They don't want to be nice to Biden's staff because they're just totally rude to any kind of activists that are backing and pushing for Bernie Sanders. So I'll close with this. I've been going for a little more than a half hour. I want to thank everybody for watching this broadcast, and I want to thank you for tuning into my updates about the coronavirus primaries over the past several days here, as I followed this very closely. So something that didn't get a lot of attention when I first started covering, and then in the 48 hours before the primary day, people finally started to take seriously what the public health risks were around holding these primaries. And just to be clear there, as it says on the banner, we do not owe the Democratic Party establishment anything. I'll leave it up to you, the viewer, to figure out what that means. I'll let you say your piece on Twitter or Facebook and make your declaration of independence, whether that means exiting the party or whether that means just making it clear that you're still going to go vote for Bernie Sanders, whether you're going to leave the presidential box blank on Election Day, whether you're going to take a moment to sit back and really contemplate what it means to vote for Joe Biden and what that sacrifice is for you, and whether you're capable of doing it given the way that the Democratic Party establishment doesn't make any genuine effort to win votes of people who are part of the left. They're hoping to win with elderly people and moderates and young people be damned. They're just now coming around when they know that they're in a bad place, when they have a dilemma. When they need us, they're thinking they can placate young people to be there for them. And I just don't know how many are going to come through because of the way that they have historically been treating Bernie Sanders supporters for this entire 2020 primary race that stretches on now for well over a year. And so we don't owe the Democratic Party establishment anything. And what that means for me, I'll end with this. What that means for me as a journalist at shadowproof.com is that you can tune in to these broadcasts. You can go to shadowproof.com and read reporting. And when I do cover Democratic Party politics and the corruption, the rot, the moral rot that is at the core, it's all around Tom Perez. It's in the Rules and Bylaws Committee. It's in the people who are holding positions, who are craven, who don't speak out when they see corruption, who think through the grapevine they can pass along messages, and that's the extent to which they'll resist what is wrong. They don't want to rock the boat too much. Oh, hey, the party has always been this way. They have healthcare insurance industry executives and healthcare executives, people there from all different industries. We don't want to offend our billionaire donors and such. And they're more worried about how they're going to deal with their funding deficits in the party. They got all this money from Mike Bloomberg that they're coasting on in the last couple of months. So what does this mean for me? We don't owe the Democratic Party establishment anything. And as a journalist, I am going to keep writing, doing the sorts of reporting that need to be done. Then I'm not going to seek any kind of approval from anyone for the work that is done. You can come to this channel and you're going to be able to find the kind of sharp analysis that I'm providing. You're going to be able to see that I'm not holding anything back because it needs to be said. Just because the two-party system does not allow for us to elect somebody as good at and in his heart, someone as good in his heart as Bernie Sanders, does not mean that we have to be callous and cold. Does that mean that we have to be political strategists and turn inward and say, well, we have no choice. We can only pick between Joe Biden and President Donald Trump. And now let's figure out how we can forgive and forget all the things between them that are actually really horrifically similar, that when you break it down, both have deficiencies that are just profoundly ugly. So I don't think that we need to lie to ourselves. If you vote for Joe Biden on November, I want you to know exactly what you're electing. If you vote for Donald Trump in November, again, people should know after 4 years, but also based on how he campaigns, what they're electing. We can't lie to ourselves. We have to talk reality. We can't live in delusions. We have to get rid of illusions. And going forward, that's what you can expect here at Shadowproof. Along with the fact that I don't do this all the time. This isn't something that I'm always covering as a beat. If you're interested, I will continue to be covering the Julian Assange extradition case, provided that continues, or when that continues again in the United Kingdom, making a trip there to London to cover an upcoming extradition hearing. And I'm going to continue to follow these whistleblower cases. We do a show every week called The Dissenter Weekly. It's still on. There'll be some updates on, and that's a Thursday show. Also the co-host of a podcast called Unauthorized Disclosure, where we dig into some other issues. I'm not always in covering Democratic Party politics so intensely, but when that was what people were transfixed upon, I have been giving that the attention that I thought it deserves. So it's quite the tumultuous time. Everyone is dealing with the impacts of the coronavirus. We have to deal with survival. We have to take care of each other. We don't have time. We don't have the mental capacity to try and convert people into voters for Bernie Sanders. And I think that's fair. I think that's absolutely fair. I don't really have the interest in trying to put together these pieces, these exposés on Biden for the purpose of trying to show people why they should vote for Bernie Sanders instead of Joe Biden at this hour, because the devastation that the coronavirus pandemic and our failure to be prepared for a pandemic is going to be so harsh on the population. And I think it's fine to focus on all of what we're seeing unfold right now and to deal with that and to be here for each other and to know that you're out there and I'm here. And I think it's good that we can interact and talk with each other. So thank you for tuning in to this broadcast, and I will be back later with another update.